Okay, I hope that you have completed your MCQs and you did relatively well for them. Now, let's look at some of the political and military developments of the war in Korea. Now, at the start, from June to September 1950, it was really a bad start for the anti-communist forces. In other words, a very bad start, obviously, for the South Koreans. Within days of the invasion, North Korea had captured Seoul. So the city in Seoul, which is in South Korea, fell. And the fighting was really bad. There were unpleasant conditions. It was the monsoon season, so it was wet, but at the same time, it was hot. So, the troops really suffered during this period of time of the war. And if you look at this map, what has happened really was that after crossing the so-called the 38th parallel, which is over here, okay, the so-called uh, the North Koreans then attacked down. All right, you can see the red line now, and basically the South Koreans and the U.S. forces were then driven down to the southeast over here, occupying an area known as Busan. So a very small area, and if the North Koreans were to continue attacking, then there's nowhere else to go really, because you would just fall into the sea. And so the anti-communist forces, the UN forces, the South Korean forces, they were in a very, very bad situation during the start of the Korean War. Now, General MacArthur basically then decided that he wanted to carry out a military so-called attack known as the Incheon landings. All right. Later on, I will show you what this means. And of course, this was his very famous quote. He says, "No, you need to back me, back my plan, or you sack me." Right? So the Americans decided, or the UN also decided that, okay, fine, it was a very bold plan, but they decided to support General MacArthur's so-called military strategy. So what was that strategy known as the Incheon landing? Basically, the plan was that MacArthur was going to launch a daring amphibious landing at the port of Incheon, going behind enemy lines and outflanking the North Korean forces. And at the same time, the US forces will break out of the Busan perimeter and advance rapidly north. Okay, and eventually you will see that MacArthur's plan actually worked, and the North Koreans would then push back to the 38th parallel. So maybe I'll show you a map. So remember, as mentioned, the North Koreans actually attacked them, right? And they were trapped. The South Koreans were trapped at Busan. So what happens is that MacArthur then launched a daring amphibious landing at the port of Incheon over here. Can you see Incheon? All right. So going really behind enemy lines. So the North Koreans obviously were surprised by this so-called amphibious landing and attack. And the North Koreans, they don't want to be trapped. So they quickly retreated. And then at the same time, the forces here at Busan broke out of their perimeters and pushed the North Koreans back. And so the North Koreans were then pushed back to the 38th parallel. Right? So quite a good strategy made by General MacArthur. Now, however, after carrying out this so-called plan, Truman then made the fateful decision of abandoning the original aim of simply expelling the North Koreans from South Korea. What that meant was that Truman then authorized the UN forces to cross the 38th parallel and then to start to attack North Korea. And so what you see was that the forces started to move and to start to invade, the territory in North Korea. So the capital city, Pyongyang, fell soon after, and then MacArthur managed to push and the forces all the way towards the Yalu River, separating North Korea and China. And this was really a dangerous and provocative move, right? So if you see this map over here, so this is around the 30th parallel. So Truman authorizing the crossing of the 30th parallel meant that the forces pushed in. And now the UN forces were occupying areas in North Korea and were very close to the Yalu River. The Yalu River is really a border, in some sense, separating China from North Korea. Why was it dangerous and provocative? Because now China feels threatened by the forces of the UN. And then the big question really is that, will China intervene in the war? And when you think about this, US was no longer really pursuing a policy of containment, but what some historians will call a rollback. In other words, recovering territory under communist control. Okay, in this case, of course, North Korea. So 6 days after the decision, UN then approved it, making the UN a co-belligerent on the side of the South Koreans rather than a policing body. Because technically speaking, it could have just stopped at the 30th parallel. But now the UN also basically approves of the idea that we can take over land that belongs to North Korea. And in some sense, it really underscores the inconsistency in US policy. Of course, it also shows that the US had tremendous influence on the UN to be able to influence the UN to support this so-called move. Now, why did America change their aims now to roll back, to attack North Korea? Well, a few reasons. Number one, wanted to teach the communist aggressors a lesson. The US also expected a quick victory, so why not just take over land in North Korea and it will be quickly completed. And of course, the prospect of a united Korea within US orbit was also quite tempting. In other words, the whole idea really is that a whole of Korea will come under US influence, and maybe, who knows, the whole of Korea might become capitalistic or democratic, or at least under US influence. So the US thought that they had to basically use this opportunity to take over areas and land in North Korea. If the 30th parallel line was restored, it would always leave the South Korea open to future attack from the north. And so America felt that, okay, maybe we should basically attack North Korea. Rollback strategy would drive communism out of Korea permanently, boost morale of the US and its capitalist allies. So another reason for why the Americans decided to carry out this strategy to attack North Korea. And the US also had some intelligence reports which claim that neither the USSR nor China would intervene. So maybe it was a good decision for the US to roll back, or at least that's what the US thought it was at the time. However, US intelligence reports were flawed. The US really underestimated the numbers of the Chinese forces. And when the Chinese mobilized their troops near the border, MacArthur thought that the Chinese mobilization was a bluff, but it was not a bluff. The Chinese were really, really concerned about the UN forces, because they thought that if they did not do anything, then China can be another possible target in the future. So why was Mao compelled to intervene? Few reasons. Presence of US troops on Chinese borders, obviously a threat to China's national security. The fear is that if China is being attacked, then Jiang Jieshi might launch a counter-revolution with the support of US armed forces. And another reason was because Stalin also encouraged Mao to enter the war to help the North Koreans, right? So we're going to watch basically a video on this. The title of this video is called "Why Did China Get Involved in the Korean War?" Do take note, of course, that this video was funded by the Chinese government. So just take note of that even as we watch this video on the Korean War.
On June the 25th, 1950, a Sunday, civil war broke out on the Korean peninsula.
中国当时知道朝鲜战争爆发是通过外电知道的。中国政府的态度，这场战争那是朝鲜自己的事务，外国不应该干涉，中国也没有干涉。但是这个时候，毛泽东已经预见到事情可能复杂化。
The day after the outbreak of war, the United States sprang into action, mobilizing its naval and air forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur.
So MacArthur understood that if America didn't get involved straight away, then the war would be won. The North would occupy the whole peninsula, and it'd be very difficult then to retake the South. It'd be much more controversial for them to then get involved when the fighting actually being concluded. So it's essentially a very rapid decision taken, one that essentially was probably illegal in international law as well. It wasn't a UN decision. It was actually before the UN had taken the necessary measures to allow the United States to get involved.
The day after it started bombing the Korean peninsula, the US convinced the United Nations to offer what was termed necessary aid to South Korea. The US government also ordered its 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait. The clear intention was to prevent the liberation of Taiwan by Chinese mainland forces.
美国时间6月27号，杜鲁门总统就发表一个公开声明，同时他还讲了一个，就是台湾地位这个现在没有定，他的确定等待跟日本合约的签订或由联合国来讨论。
The island of Taiwan had been occupied by the Kuomintang during the Chinese Civil War. By June 1950, the People's Liberation Army was ready to liberate it.
我们的邻国朝鲜发生了内战，因为美国凭空派军队侵犯中国的台湾所以说他说这是完全毫无道理的，这完全是个侵略行为。
This was seen as an act against Chinese sovereignty. They believed that China had the rightful governance over Taiwan. But from an American perspective, they could easily ignore this. They knew that the Chinese didn't have the capacity to threaten the 7th Fleet there.
Evidently, the move was part of the US strategy of isolating and surrounding China.
Truman actually gave much greater assistance from that day too to the French in Indochina, where they were fighting against the Viet Minh communist insurrection there, as they believed again that the Chinese were going to come into that conflict.
By June 1950, the nascent People's Republic of China was facing threats from many sides.
美国人现在3把刀，第1把刀从朝鲜这边来，是插在我们中国的头上；第2把刀是从台湾这边来，插在我们腰上；第3把刀，它不是支援在这个法国在越南的侵略战争吗？从越南来，插在我们的脚上。这个天下有变，他就从这几个方面来对付我们。
But the protests by the People's Republic of China, just a year into its existence, fell on deaf ears in the international community.
So you can see from this documentary, at least made by the Chinese government, right? At least from their point of view, it seems to suggest that China really felt threatened by the US. And the Chinese had given prior warnings to the US, don't come too close to the border, because if you do so, basically we are going to respond. And at first, Mao sent a few volunteers across the border, and they did halt MacArthur's so-called advance. Then they deliberately withdrew into the mountains to test the U.S. intentions, to see whether or not what the U.S. would do, or would the U.S. actually pull back. But the U.S. did not. Premier Zhou Enlai from China then cabled the UN, stating that any continuation of the Korean War would lead to basically the widening of the conflict. And what Zhou Enlai really meant here was that then China might have to intervene in the war. But General MacArthur continues offensive, and so the Chinese government basically decided that, okay, we need to now resist America. And so nearly 100,000 Chinese troops, basically from the People's Volunteer Army, poured across the Yalu River and start attacking the UN forces. Now, this amount is huge. Nearly 250,000 Chinese troops coming in to attack the UN force. Right, and so as mentioned, the Yalu River over here, so the Chinese starts to now attack and send their forces to support the North Koreans. And what will happen would be that the UN forces will then actually pull back and retreat. And they will then later on retreat all the way back to the 38 parallel line. So this comes to the end of today's lesson. Again, please complete the MCQ questions for this part of the video. And once you have completed the MCQ questions, that will come to the end for today's History HBL. All right. So thank you so much, gentlemen, and I'll see you soon in school next week. Take care. Goodbye.